issues of human rights. We have to accentuate the issues of democracy and global cooperation. We can't have this go-it-alone attitude anymore. We can't have this America is always right attitude. I think the most important thing that we can do is we've got to help our fellow Americans understand that it's not about one superpower versus another superpower or one superpower alone. It's about a multipolar society. It's about a multitude of nations. And we have to work together as one nation of many. And if we do that, and we stand up for the principles that we like to think America is about, I think America can be a very strong force of leadership. Not because we're the richest country in the world or the most military powerful, but because we stand by the courage of our convictions. And I think that's what we have to do as citizens and voters to kind of keep the peace process going.
Dr. Shambayati, and the question again is, how can we strengthen our government's attitudes towards creating a peaceful conclusion that can be interpreted as winning?
Well, I mean, to win something, all you need to do is to declare that you have won it, especially if you're a superpower. So that part of it, I think, is another question. But I think what we need is not a government problem. It's basically the public attitude problem. And it's not just changing how the government reacts. We have to rethink of what, as individuals, how we think about the world and the problems of the world. So I think it's a much more serious problem than just saying that all we need to do is to change the structure of the government or the government policies. We have to actually reconsider many of our own values, many of the way of how we act, of what is important to us, what is our interest is, and that would take much longer time than probably we have.
Thank you. Dr. Kaufman?
Well, you know, I think that I think most Americans today are preoccupied with domestic issues. They're concerned with employment. They're concerned with the future of entitlement programs, with questions of government deficits and so forth. And so I think these crises in the Middle East, they resonate with the American public, you know, very differently today than they would have, for example, before the financial crisis of 2008. So I think from the public's point of view, nobody wants to see another protracted conflict in the Middle East. You know, people are sick of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you know, voters don't really point to terrorism as a particularly important public policy issue or something that affects them. I think within those parameters, the United States should recognize, I mean, the Obama administration, I think, should recognize that there are significant limits to its power, both in terms of public opinion and what the public is willing to do in terms of military overstretch, in terms of the influence of the United States, as Tom's been pointing out, in terms of the influence of the United States with other governments in the region. So I think the Obama administration has a very limited amount of political capital in terms of what it can do in the region. And so I think it's important to understand that, and hopefully they'll use their limited influence wisely.
This may be a rhetorical question, but I'll offer it to the panel in any case. Is anyone here naive enough to not believe that the U.S. ruling class does anything abroad if there isn't anything in it for them? And I'm wondering if any of the panelists, perhaps Dr. Shambayati, would you be interested in answering?
Well, I guess I'm the most cynical person here, so. Let me say, I would take the view that we shouldn't be naive enough to think anybody, whether they are the ruling class or not, would do things that are not in their interest. The problem is not the interest, is that how to redefine that interest to basically point out that our interest is best served by peaceful solutions. Our interest is best served by having a reasonable energy policy. Our interest is best served by protecting the environment. So that doesn't mean that we are not active in our interest, but it's redefining our interest. So I don't think it's just a matter of the ruling classes. It's the nature of being a human being.
Problem?
And the question again is?
Is anyone here naive enough not to believe that the U.S. ruling class does anything abroad if there isn't anything in it for them?
Right. No, I'm not naive enough.
Thank you, Mr. George.
Actually, yesterday I got a YouTube clip that's going around, kind of, I guess, from the right-wing blogosphere right now, from a friend of mine. It's Louis Farrakhan talking about the situation in Libya. And, of course, he takes a very cynical view of what's going on there in terms of how this is all about other people's self-interest. And he makes a lot of valid points, but I think we have to be careful not to get too mired down in that cynicism. When we talk about Libya, for example, certainly, it's human nature. I mean, the self-interests are going to be there for anybody who's making a decision. But at the same time, we've got to allow some room in our hearts for the idea that every once in a while somebody can do something for the right thing. It may be 90% of the reasoning, it may be 60% of the reasoning, maybe it's 45% of their reasoning, but they can do something for the right thing. And we've got to allow the institutions that we live under, we've got to allow them that flexibility. If we lose that perspective in our hearts, if we lose that ability to think that every once in a while at least somebody can do something for the right reason, then we're not going to change anything, and things are just going to continue to get worse and worse.
This audience member introduces the famous term war on terror. How big a factor in the present mix of these conflicts is that concept of the war on terror? And why don't we start with Mr. George?
I think it's becoming less and less of a factor by the day with this administration. You have to understand that the war on terror is motivated by a lot of different things. The war on terror, first of all, is motivated in a lot of people's minds by the very real fears that 9/11 and those situations dredged up. It's also motivated by a very cynical political class's ability to manipulate people into doing what they want under the rubric of the war on terror. And it is also motivated in a large part by religious extremists, not just Islamist extremists, but Christian extremists, Jewish extremists. These extremists kind of feed each other, and they create this perpetual fear, which then the politicians say, oh, this is the war on terror, they've got to fight it. Now, with everything that's going on with the economic situation, the fact that there hasn't been a major terrorist attack here in the U.S. in a while, and the fact that we're seeing these nationalist movements kind of coming to the fore, the war on terror is becoming less and less of a factor every day. Now, I guarantee you, if we have this discussion this time next year, as the 2012 election is coming up, it's going to be much larger in people's mind because political factions are going to want to reassert that fear and that control that they have over people by calling attention to the war on terror. So right now, it's becoming less of a factor, but it may become a much larger factor again if we're not careful.
Dr. Coughlin?
Well, yeah, I think what Jeff is saying is kind of interesting, because public opinion can be manipulated, right? So that, for example, during the 1980s, the Reagan administration launched the war on drugs, and we talked about drugs incessantly, and so after a while, there were some public opinion polls that showed that Americans thought that drugs were the biggest problem that the country was facing, and this was really a factor of how political elites were able to set the agenda in terms of what the political conversation is. And so I guess on those grounds, I don't underestimate the ability for the war on terror to make a comeback, even though it's not at the forefront of people's minds right now.
Dr. Shambat?
I mean, one thing, of course, to keep in mind is that Obama administration has been very careful not to use that term. So they have put war on terror on the back, at least the terminology for it outside. I think what has also happened is not only in the public mind, but the Obama administration has made a distinction between the efforts to fight terrorism and the need for more freedom in the Middle East or support for the authoritarian regimes. And that's what we are seeing, that they no longer see that these two have been completely connected to each other, and that there is a possibility that they have taken the view that, in fact, we can support to some extent, democratization in the Middle East without having a concern about terrorism. Now, how that would play in the American politics is, of course, a different matter. If there is a terrorist attack, that, of course, will bring it back. But in terms of just public opinion, I think one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is that some of these issues, you can use them once. And eventually, people get tired of them. So war on terror might have worked in 2000 or in whatever it was, 2004. But it's very difficult, it might be very difficult to bring that back with the same gusto that had done before. So, but that doesn't mean that there would not be something else to replace that. But I don't think the war on terror is is as important anymore in terms of the way that was framed originally. And what has happened, obviously, we're still interested in stopping terrorist attacks, we're still interested in fighting terrorism, but the conclusion has been that you are at a different stage. And this is not the same war on terror that existed in maybe 4 or 5 years ago even.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. We've come to the time of our final remarks. I want to thank the audience very much for your questions. And we'd like to start in the opposite order in which we began. So Dr. Shambayati will be giving you a final remark of 3 minutes for each panelist. And your closing remarks, sir.
Okay. Well, I've already used all of my closing remarks. But let me put it this way. I mean, obviously the Middle East is entering a new stage. Where it's going is not clear. We have had major changes. We have signals both positive and negative. In some countries, obviously, the ruling dictators have been removed from power, primarily in Egypt and Tunisia. It is still not clear what kind of regime would replace them. We have even in those two countries, we have a very strange situation that we are relying on the military to basically democratize the society. But in the rest of the world, usually the process has been reversed. In other parts of the Middle East, that for a variety of reasons, including foreign support, the authoritarian regimes seem to have actually stabilized their position. So we are going through a period of very exciting period in Middle Eastern history, but also a very uncertain period, and in terms of what will happen. Now, the hope is, of course, that in the long term things would be better, but every time I use the term long term, I'm reminded by quotation from Maynard Keynes that the only thing that we are sure of in the long term is that we die. The rest of it, we don't know. And so, but the short term and the medium term, I think what we have is a very exciting but very uncertain period for most of the Middle Eastern countries. And in terms of if you think of it in terms of the U.S. relations in the area. And for those of us who study the Middle East, this has meant that we have to reevaluate most of what we thought we knew about the Middle East. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mr. George.
I want to thank everyone for coming out, and this has been some great questions. This has been a great panel. I particularly like when I'm on a panel when everyone agrees with me, so that's always nice.
Makes it easier.
Yes, much easier. Imagine if we went back and we were having this conversation about the Ottoman Empire in 1911 as opposed to 2011. Imagine from the perspective that we have now 100 years later, if we could go back and look at the changes that have happened in society, some good, some bad. Would we look at these changes, not just in the Middle East, but the way some of these issues have grown out from the Middle East and the way that they affect the globe as a whole? Would we say that we're on a generally positive trend, or would we say that we're one step away from the apocalypse? I tend to take the view that we're on a generally positive trend. I tend to take the view that humanity is kind of on an upward trajectory. And, you know, in so many ways, when we look at the foundations of civilization, when we look at the beginnings of civilization, we're talking about this area of the Middle East that we're looking at now. And I think what we need to do is we need to maintain a sense of optimism. There's a lot of uncertainty. Certainly this is an exciting time. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. But we can't lose the perspective that with all the political challenges and all the military challenges and all the social and cultural challenges that we're facing, we can't give up on the idea that we can make a positive change, that we can change these institutions. Because going back to that example of 1911, I think in terms of how the world is about to change, it's very similar to looking at what the world was right before World War I and World War II to what the world is now. We're in for a very dramatic change. And I happen to think that it's not going to be another global war type of situation, but it's going to be a global awakening. It's going to be a global interest in democracy. It's going to be about globalization the right way, where we're going to come together as a global human society. Because I think that's the next stage in the evolution. And I think when we talk about what's happening in the Middle East, what we're seeing is we're seeing the beginning of that. We're seeing the conception of that. And how we deal with these situations in the Middle East is going to determine where the rest of the 21st century and where humanity as a whole goes. And in the long term, I am going to die, I know that, but I'm optimistic that humanity is going to be in a better place on that day when I die than we are now. And I hope that if there's one thing that everybody can take away from all this, it's that, you know, we can talk about these things and we can envision a better future, and that means we can actually make it happen.
Thank you very much, Mr. George. Mr. Cochran? Dr. Cochran, I'm sorry.
Well, sometimes I talk to my students about the Henry Ford theory of history. And Henry Ford said, you know, history is just one damn thing after another. That's the Henry Ford theory of history. But I think Jeff raises an important point that, you know, progress isn't something that's just automatic. You know, progress is something that we have to make happen. And you know, a global community isn't somehow a part of human evolution. A global community is something that you know, we have to create, that we have to construct. And so I think the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci said it best. He said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. They're just that these conversations, I think, are so important to this community, and I am so honored to have been invited to moderate here. I've had the opportunity these last 2 days to participate in a conference called Imagine Solutions, where people from all over the world were brought in or had worldly experience to talk about social entrepreneurship and social justice. There was a woman who had been a victim of human trafficking in the Middle East who had turned her victimhood into an opportunity to advocate for other victims of human trafficking. And there's also a very interesting gentleman who has said he has relatives who are Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, and so he has this tremendous view of the world and has been a filmmaker. And he is the one who produced the film, I believe it's called What a Billion Muslims Think About the West, or the title is something to that effect. And he talked about basically that he tries to avert clashes of civilization. Rather, he thinks what the reality is that there's a clash of misunderstanding. And I think these conversations help us put that into context, and I think the minds that you have here really helped explain that well tonight. And I want to thank very much the audience for their questions. There were so many questions here. We were able to ask the majority of them. But again, thank you for your thoughtfulness and for your attendance here today. And I turn it back over to Jessica.
Yeah, just reflecting a bit of what the panel already said. Thank you again for coming out. Just a couple of things, if I can say on behalf of EPEC. We want you to leave here with a sense of hope. So first thing you can do is talk to your friends, talk to your family members, keep the conversation going. Don't let it just end here tonight. The second thing is keep involved in the community. It can be a little bit frustrating, especially from a student standpoint. You know, what can I do about the federal government? But things you can do is work on your local officials, electing the people that share your vision and your ideas and your values. And keep checking back on our website for environmental and peace issues that are going on in the community. And thank you again so much for coming out, and thanks to the panelists.
Can I make my comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, I just want to make my comment. I feel it's important.
Okay.
Okay, I'm nervous when okay, I have to sit down.
Okay. Okay, stretch out.
From the, you know, I was born in South Africa. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've been here since 1977. And when I hear
the term terrorist, I want to break up laughing. Because, you know, we call it the boogeyman or whatever it is. When apartheid was in, they scared the daylights out of us. We were always checking under the bed. Maybe there's some pathetic black man that's going to kill us off, or what, I don't know. But we were all scared. So when I hear this, the terrorist story, I never believe it, because when you think about Yemen, there's about 300 of these people that's a bit rowdy there, that's Al-Qaeda. And I have a problem with that. I think when you invade a nation, you create the terrorist. I mean, we were, as I will say this quickly, the World War happened in 1899 to 1902. And we, from the Afrikaans side, we fought the British with everything. 10-year-old, 9-year-old, we probably would be called then, you know, when, what do you say, the people that throw, that burn themselves up and stuff like this, they called us the suiciders. So when you invade a nation, if America gets invaded, we will fight them tooth and nail too. And there were lots of young terrorists running around here too. That's my statement. Sorry. So
No,
Thank you.